If you've been in aviation for any amount of time, then you've probably had a bad flight instructor. Or if you haven't personally had one, you've absolutely heard stories about it. Flight instructing can be one of the most challenging jobs in the world. I would argue even in the sphere of teaching, flight instruction can be extremely intense and difficult from your normal aspects of teaching, because on top of just teaching materials, you're also teaching them how to fly an aircraft, right? You're not just a flight instructor to them, you're a mentor, you're a friend, and a teacher. I still to this day just remember my first flight as a flight instructor, and I kind of got thrown into it a little bit. I had no idea what I was doing. I met my student down in the lobby of the airport, and we went out to the plane. That was my first time genuinely instructing outside of just the normal training I did to get a CFI. I finally had that moment where I was like, all right, it's go time, right? And I don't think that I was very good. I was so nervous. My palms were sweaty. I didn't know what to do. I kind of just wung it. It's a huge responsibility. I'm going to talk to you about 6 tips and 6 qualities of good flight instructors. So hopefully you don't have the same experience that I did. We're going to be talking about everything from just the overall good traits that you need to have as an instructor, professionalism, being kind, to everything about more practical tips, like how to be a stickler on certain things. You as a CFI, you're not just teaching someone how to fly, you are creating the entire next generation of pilots. These are going to be people that you are going to be sharing the skies with in the future. That's why it's essential that you train them the right way to make them safe pilots. How we teach is just as important as what we teach. If you're new around here, my name's Hayden T-Tech. I'm a certified flight instructor with hours of flight training given. And I want to share with you the 6 traits that I have learned to make myself a good, efficient instructor. Lesson 1, lead by example. It's incredible how much information students pick up from you, even if they don't realize that they're doing it. A small habit that you have that you do one time, your student is going to subconsciously take that in and they're going to perform that every single time. A good CFI, you are 1 part teacher, 1 part mentor, 1 part friend. These students are always watching you. One thing that makes a good CFI from an okay CFI from a bad CFI is the ability to be constantly learning, always trying to improve yourself. A good flight instructor isn't just somebody who can fly the airplane and have good and stick and rudder skills. A good CFI is someone who constantly wants to better themselves. You yourself being a lifelong learner and teaching these students the new things that you learn, that's going to rub off on them and help them understand that they need to be continuing to learn along throughout the entire process. It's fairly frequent that the FAA releases new documents or new letters of interpretation or new advisory circulars that you as a CFI have an obligation to read. It's so easy to skip over them, but if you aren't reading them and you aren't understanding them, how are you supposed to reflect those onto your students? If you don't know something that the student is trying to ask you, tell them you don't know it, and then you guys can look it up together. It shows them that you have a willingness to keep learning, and it also helps them learn where to find the answer. I read this quote once by Albert Schweitzer. It says that example isn't the main thing that influences others. It's the only thing. If you want your students to have certain traits, then you need to be able to have those yourself. Couple tips for you. Always dress professionally, at least decent. Don't show up to the airport in ripped jeans and a hoodie. Wear a decent pair of pants, maybe something with a collar. You don't need to dress up and wear a suit every day, but look decent. Be well groomed. Be shaven, have your teeth brushed, have your hair combed, cut. Look decent. Another tip is stay current on your knowledge. I said there's so many different articles you could read every minute of your life for the rest of your life and probably not even cover half of the information that the FAA has put out there. If you don't know an answer, admit it. Don't try to make something up. Try to show up on time. In short, you should be the pilot that you want your students to become. Example number 2, be a stickler. When you first start instructing, you're going to want your students to love you. You're going to want to be best friends with them. This isn't always the best course of action. You don't want to be too easy on them. You want to be a stickler for procedures from the get-go. Hound on them over checklist usage. Hound on them for doing a good pre-flight. Be kind of a pain. I always tell my students that I will be your best friend outside of the airplane. But in the airplane, I am your teacher, you are my student. It's all of those little things and all of those little habits, like checklist usage, that form the good habits of being a flight instructor. I mentioned this before, but your students are going to absorb everything that you do. If you as an instructor skip a pre-flight once, or you as an instructor skip a checklist, your students are going to think that that's acceptable, and moving forward, they're going to do the same thing. You have to be very articulate with your words and very conscious about what you're saying and what you're doing, because chances are they are going to take that habit from you and incorporate that into their flying. I encourage you to look at some of the habits that you have from flying, and you could probably tell me which instructor you had that had that habit. Also, side note, but there's like a windstorm outside. I think it's like gusting like 40 knots at the airport down the road from me. So if you're hearing some wind noise, it's fine. My house will probably stay up. Or on the other hand, if you yourself have a bad habit, you could also probably still tell me which instructor taught you that. Totally embarrassing story of mine, but I once took off without a fuel cap on my plane. We used to have a 162 Skycatcher, which had the fuel caps on top of the wings, just like a Skyhawk. Gotten back from a discovery flight, and I didn't know that while I was inside debriefing with that student and grabbing my next student, that the line guys had come and put fuel in the plane. I figured I was only in there for 5 minutes, and I failed to check to make sure that the fuel cap was securely put back on. I got down to the runway to do my run up, and someone made a radio call saying that they found a fuel cap sitting in the run-up area. That right there, that was pretty early on in my instructing career. And from there, I have learned that I don't want to be skipping these habits. I especially don't want to be teaching my students these bad habits. I want to lead by example, even if I don't think anybody's watching. First couple times that you do a pre-flight with a student, eventually you're going to send them on their own. But the first couple of times you do it with them, make it as thorough as possible. Teach them every little intricacy of that airplane. Because over time, those habits from your student are probably going to fade. But if you teach them 100 good habits, and by the end of it, they're still practicing 50 good habits, I'd still say that's a win, as opposed to teaching them 50 habits from the get-go, and then all of a sudden now they only have 10. Use your checklists religiously. Lists are the bread and butter of everything we do in aviation. Even if you are out there flying with the student or demonstrating something, run through the checklist. The first time that a student sees you do something without reading through the checklist first, it has entered into their mind that they are totally fine to skip that checklist or to skip the other checklist. Next thing you know, they're taking off with their mixture all the way leaned and their engine sputter. Use your checklists religiously, even if you have everything memorized, even if your plane has 4 buttons. Finally, enforce these standards. I want you to be gentle at first, but you also need to be firm. You don't need to scold them for not being within standards, but you need to gently remind them and be firm about it. Don't let their altitude drift off by 100 feet. Remind them that that's not the altitude you're hanging on to. Be strict about that. Be very intentional with what the airplane is doing. Remind your students that they don't want to let the plane fly them, that they are flying the airplane. I want you to be a stickler on speeds and altitudes and procedures. If a student tries to skip a checklist because they don't have it memorized, hold down on the brakes till they do it. Remind them that we don't skip checklists. I want to read a quote from Aristotle. The quote goes, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." I think that quote's pretty self-explanatory, but what that's saying is we can't be excellent if we are not showing excellence. And it's not just a one-off thing. It's not just, all right, we're going to teach them right the first time and then get lax. It's a repeated action. The longer you do it, the easier it's going to be. The first couple of times it might feel super slow to the instructor while you're working through those checklists with them, but they're going to pick it up over time, and you have taught them such a fantastic habit. When you become a CFI, it's a very strange transition to go from trainee to trainer. Oftentimes throughout the course of your flight training, you would have been taught some bad habits. It is essential that throughout time, you unlearn these bad habits and figure out the right way to do things. A great instructor is always refining their own techniques to be a more efficient teacher. If you guys have any fantastic habits that you've picked up throughout flying or instructing, comment them down below. Segment 3, care about your students' future. We want to prioritize mentorship in this industry as opposed to just mere teaching. You as a student's primary instructor, chances are you are the introduction that they have to aviation. They might have family members or something that have been airline pilots, or they might know somebody that's in aviation, but the majority of the time, you are the first person that they are interacting with that has anything to do with flying. You know that this is an extremely complicated field to navigate through. So be their mentor, be there to answer questions that they have and help guide them along that process. In this section, we're really switching from the procedure aspect to the personal aspect of it. Now, there's nothing from a legal standpoint that says that you need to be a great human being to be a flight instructor. But I genuinely believe that it takes just as much effort to be a good one as it does a bad one. Being a CFI, even though it is a stepping stone in your career, it's not just about logging hours. Think back to your training. You probably had good and bad instructors, and the bad ones were probably the ones that were just there to milk the hours out of you and get out of there. The ones that you learn the most from are the ones that genuinely care. And oftentimes that's not like a career-long flight instructor. It is somebody building up time to go to the airlines, but they genuinely care and they want you to succeed. Every single one of my students that I have gotten through their private stage, most of them went off to other schools like ATP or went off to college for the rest of their flight training. I still talk to them and I still check in with them all the time, and I celebrate their successes with them. And oftentimes they come back and thank me for teaching them these good habits and being there and help guiding them along the path. And I can tell you that that is the most rewarding thing I've ever experienced. Hey, I passed my check ride. Hey, I passed my stage check. Thank you for blah, 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 blah. That makes me so unbelievably happy. Seeing a student's goals and listening to their goals is just as important as trying to chase yours to get to the airlines. Whether the student wants to go to the airlines or they're just learning to fly for fun, the CFI needs to prioritize their goals and make them a safe pilot in the process. Believe in your students when others don't. Oftentimes, the student isn't even going to believe in themselves after they screw something up. Be there, remind them of their end goal, and be there for them and help them reach their next goals. You genuinely have the honor of being able to change your students' lives. I'm sure that you have seen instructors throughout your time as an instructor or a student that have just cared so much. They'll stay after your flight and talk with you for as long as you need, or come in early and talk with you for as long as you need. The night before your check ride, when you're freaking out, trying to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow, they're there to calm your nerves. That's the instructor you want to be. Care for them on a deeper level than just being a teacher or just getting hours out of them. A quote from Theodore Roosevelt says, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care," which makes total sense, right? That if a student doesn't think that you care about them, they're not going to want to learn from you. They're going to dread coming in for flights each time. They're going to think, oh, he's just here for the hour. Show your students that you care. Tell them that you care. Celebrate their successes with them. Ask your students what their goals are. Ask them if they want to go to the airline someday, or if they're just doing this as a hobby. Tailor your training towards that and ask them why. I want you to be available and approachable. Your students are going to have your personal number. If they text you, don't wait 3 days to respond. Ask them. Do less talking and more listening. Many of us picture students in a lecture hall being lectured by a teacher, but flight instruction is very different because it's so one-on-one. It should be an equal exchange of talking between the two. One of my favorite ways to do this is scenario-based training, which you've probably learned quite a bit about while you were training for your flight instructor, but it allows the student to actively engage and participate in these ways. I'm sure all of us flight instructors know that the best way to learn something is to have to teach it to somebody else. I don't know if you hear that wind, but it's getting pretty scary. Teach your students these tips. Teach your student a lesson, and then ask them to go home and research it a bit, and then the next time you meet with them, have them teach it to you. The pressure of them having to teach it to you and the fear of them saying something wrong is going to motivate them to learn it even better. This is going to do more than just have them understand the material. It's also going to boost their confidence. Think about during a ground lesson, instead of you just explaining how the engine works, the 4 cycles of an engine work, you ask your student to have done the research, and then they get to come in and teach you. Oftentimes when I'm teaching my students, I can see their eyes kind of glaze over and they start daydreaming about different things. But when they are actively engaged in the process and they have to teach you, it's going to intensify the learning scenario as a whole. You may need to answer a couple questions that they have and fill in the gaps of the information that they're missing, but it's still going to make a huge difference. Ask your students a ton of questions. When they ask you, hey, should I do this or should I do this? Ask them, well, what do you think? What do you think you should do? Especially if it's something that you've taught them in the past, because this encourages them to think about it, make decisions on their own without always relying on you. Ask these open-ended questions like why or how, and get them to explain it to you about why they made that decision or how this system works. And just listen without judgment. And after the fact, you can correct them if they're wrong, but just listen. You absolutely will get comfortable with silence. A lot of times in the plane, they have so many different things and feelings and emotions running through their head that you're going to be sitting there in just silence, trying to understand what they're learning, what they're thinking, and you can ask them questions. But a lot of the time in the plane, when they have a high task load, it's going to be silence. Embrace it. It's not always a bad thing. Don't feel like you need to fill that empty space with conversation. One thing that I love doing is having students come up with a plan for the next lesson, especially when they get closer to check ride prep. At that point, they should know what they're pretty good at and what they need to work on. Ask them to come up with a plan for the next lesson, and then you follow their plan, you follow their lead. And finally, like I mentioned, use that scenario-based training that we were talking about. If I have a student that's really struggling with landings, then I will physically take the controls and I just want them to teach me, to walk me through the steps that I need to be doing. Tell me if I'm high or low, fast, slow, how I need to correct for that. Oftentimes, only focusing on the what's going on and just talking about it is so much easier than trying to actually do it as well. Learning is so much more valuable when you allow a student to screw up and you allow them to fix it on their own. It's going to be super uncomfortable at first. And over time, your tolerance to that level of risk is going to grow. But at the beginning, it's going to feel super uncomfortable. Let them make mistakes and learn from it, as long as safety isn't being compromised, obviously. Allow your student to do as much flying and as much decision-making as possible. Section 5. Keep calm and fly on. There's going to be so many students that test your patience. It is going to get extremely stressful, and there's going to be things that your students are struggling with, and you are going to get frustrated. Working on your patience of not getting frustrated and not getting disappointed and not taking it out on your students is one of the most essential things about flight training. Try to keep calm. Try to talk to them in a soothing, calm voice, because they're often going to get frustrated. Keep order in the cockpit and try to keep everyone on the same page. Keep everybody calm. Allow them to feel a little frustrated by their performance, because often that's going to improve that learning, because you're not going to want to make that same mistake again. But don't let it get too far. A flight instructor that is yelling is the worst type of instructor. The only time your voice should ever be raised in an airplane is if safety is compromised and you need to raise your voice to get your point across. That is the only time. When you are instructing, you should never raise your voice at a student. Why does this matter? Well, when a student is getting yelled at or lectured about something, their brain is going to switch into fight or flight mode. And they're either going to come back with you and start arguing back with you, or they're just going to shut down. And no more learning is going to be done the rest of that lesson. It's important to keep your calm and turn these into valuable learning experiences. Fairly early on in my instructing career, I had just taken off with a plane on a student's first or second lesson. And almost immediately after departure, we ended up getting pretty severe engine roughness. We figured out later that the plane had a pretty cracked cylinder. But as soon as we take off, we see our RPM starting to fluctuate. We feel the engine vibrating. And I immediately took the controls, brought it around in the pattern, and was like, yeah, we're not going to go fly. And we set it down. And that student ended up sticking with it. And we debriefed after about what had gone on. But I think my era of calm, even though internally I was kind of freaking out, but on the outside, I stayed calm. That allowed the student to realize that these things happen and we need to be prepared and ready to do something about when they happen. And that being stressed and being flustered about it isn't doing anybody any good. The scary, frustrating moments can often be turned into a fantastic learning experience. So you as an instructor, how can you take these and put these into effect? Use a calm, soothing voice. The voice that I'm talking to you at the moment is how I'm talking 99.9% of in the plane. Even when something is exciting and serious is going on, have a calm tone, a relaxing voice. If you need to get something across urgently, you can pick it up a little bit, but never, ever to the point of yelling. You don't want to insult or ridicule your students. Don't call them names. Don't call them dumb. Don't call them stupid. Those instances, one comment made the wrong way that you didn't intend to make or they took it out of the way is going to ruin their confidence. When you are debriefing with a student, make sure you do it in a constructive way and not just a way that they leave feeling like they suck. Give them tips. Help them learn for next time. You also need to be able to manage your own stress. Being a CFI is an extremely stressful part in most flight instructors' lives because you're working all the time and you have no money to spend. You don't get much of a social life. You need to keep those stresses outside of the aircraft, outside of the work environment, even though it's hard. Learn how to do breathing exercises. I'm not kidding. Learn ways to calm yourself down and go in with a clear mind. You want to encourage just an overall positive environment. Make the cockpit a place where they get excited to go, that they get excited to tell you stories, that get them excited to learn and excited to be there. Don't make it a place where they dread coming in because they're not going to make it. And finally, the final tip that I have for you is to let the students lead. You want to empower independence and empower independent thinking with your students. I mean, think about it. You're sitting in the right seat. They're sitting in the left seat. The left seat is typically the pilot in charge's seat, right? Allow them to lead. You want them making their own decisions, having their own thoughts. You don't want them asking you, hey, should I do this? Should I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? After every single question, you want them to be able to make those decisions on their own. And oftentimes they're going to make mistakes with it. And that's okay because they're going to learn from it. They're going to improve it. I'm not always a big fan of being called a flight instructor. I see myself a lot more as like a coach or a mentor a lot of the times. I'm trying to guide them in the right direction while also teaching them. But I'm trying to guide them to be safe, independent pilots, not to be good at taking instructions from me. The student is ultimately in charge of their learning, not you. No one, including the best flight instructor on the planet, can force somebody to learn something. You have to motivate them to learn it themselves. Provide encouragement to them. We briefly talked about this earlier, but you need to allow them to make mistakes. As long as it doesn't compromise safety to the point of unrecovery, allow them to make mistakes and learn from their mistakes and then talk after about why that wasn't the right decision. But you still want them to make the decision, make the call from the get-go. Because once they get their license, you're not going to be there with them anymore. They're going to be independent pilots even when they get to solo. You're not going to be there for them. You want to teach a series of common sense and the ability to just make decisions on their own. If you never allow them to make mistakes, they're never going to learn what the wrong decision looks like and how to get out of it. One of the hardest things an instructor has to do is sit on their hands and fight the urge to grab the controls from their students. A student who knows that they have messed up and fixes it without you saying a word is the best student that you can make. You're going to have to let them make hard landings. You're going to have to let them tune in the wrong frequency. You're going to have to let them get a little bit of lost on their training. Let them do that. And maybe every now and then nudge them in the right direction and get them to realize their mistake if they're not. But it is essential that you allow them to make these mistakes and fix it on their own. So far, we've covered the 6 qualities that I believe make a good instructor. And hopefully you can take some of these and apply them to yourself. Make yourself a better flight instructor. Even if it is just a temporary thing for you while you're building hours to go to the airlines, make the most out of this time and treat this job as the honor that it is. You get to teach people how to fly airplanes. The habits that you teach, the habits that you show, the way you teach is all going to be reflected in the next generation of pilots that, give it some time, you're going to be sharing the skies with. Think about, you want your students as someone sitting in the first officer seat when you're a captain at the airlines. That's the kind of student that you want to create. Being a good CFI is a balancing act. You're not just a flight instructor. You are a coach, a mentor, a friend, a therapist. And it's an honor to wear all of these hats. It's extremely difficult, but like I mentioned, it is so rewarding when you get to see everything that you've taught them come to fruition. The impact of a good flight instructor lasts a lifetime. I'm going to say that again. The impact of a good flight instructor lasts a lifetime. Even though flight instructors are some of the most underappreciated people in the aviation industry, I would argue that they are some of, if not the most important people in aviation. To treat this job with respect. You are doing the most important work in flying. And maybe shoot your instructor a text and thank them for being a good instructor as you are going through your training. So I've shared with you the 6 most important tips that I have for being a good instructor, but I also want to hear from you. Let me know down below some of the good traits that you think a good flight instructor should have. If you like this kind of video and you want to see it again in the future, hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, like it. All right. I will see you guys next week.